Continuing on in our series called The Big Dance. You know, nothing gets me more frustrated in the NCAA tournament than when I'm watching my favorite team compete when all of a sudden one of the officials makes a bad call and it completely changes the complexion of the game for my team. Well, I heard a story about a guy named Tom that was on the receiving end of a bad call in life. Tom was living at home with his dad. He was working for the family business. And Tom's mom, she had died years earlier. Well, Tom found out that he was going to inherit a fortune whenever his sickly dad died. So he decided that he needed to go out and he needed to find a wife that he was going to be able to share his future and his fortune with. Well, one night at an investment meeting, he spotted the most beautiful woman that he had ever seen. Her beauty was so much that it took his breath away. So Tom, he goes up to this gal and he says, "Hey, I know that I look like just an ordinary guy, but here in just a few years, my dad's going to die, and I'm going to inherit $20 million. Well, the woman, she was very impressed, and she goes ahead and she takes Tom's business card, and then 3 days later, she becomes his stepmom. Women are so much better at estate planning. Have you ever been on the receiving end of a bad call in life? You know, maybe somebody cheated you out of a large chunk of money. Maybe you lost out on the inheritance and there's nothing that you can do about it. Maybe you went through a really bad divorce and your ex really stuck it to you. Maybe you've tried to live a good life, but all of a sudden you discover that you can't have kids and you're angry at God for what seems so unfair. Well, nobody ever suffered greater injustice than Jesus Christ. On the final night of his life, he was the victim of hypocrisy, of lies, deceit, physical abuse, and betrayal. But he never lost his dignity, and he never lost his sense of purpose. Let's look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. It says, "Christ suffered for you. He is your example, and you must follow his steps." Well, this morning, I want us to look at the abuse that Jesus experienced in his trials. You know, Jesus, he didn't go through just one trial. He went through at least 5 different trials. So the first trial that I want us to look at was with Annas. The first trial was with Annas, who was the Jewish high priest. Remember, Jesus was arrested in the middle of the Garden of Gethsemane. He was there and he was praying when all of a sudden he heard an angry mob starting to come towards him. Well, he went right away to the gate and he surrendered to them. He voluntarily surrendered. He did not resist arrest. But listen to John 18:13. It says, "First, they took him to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year." So the first thing that they did whenever they arrested Jesus was they tied him up. That was the normal process for somebody whenever they were arrested. They did this to keep him from being able to fight back or run away. So they tied Jesus up like he was this rebellious criminal. And then they took him to Annas, who was the high priest according to Jewish tradition. Now this seems to be a pretty short opening trial. Annas, he was in on the plot, and he probably met them near where they were going to have the second trial. Now, I'm sure they kind of brought Annas in for a nod of approval because he was in on this whole thing. Well, the next trial that I want us to see was with Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. Next, Jesus stood trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas, he was the high priest that was recognized by the Roman authorities. This man was a huge hypocrite. And most of the Sanhedrin, they hated Jesus because he was a threat to their power. Jesus had not came through their system. He didn't follow their traditions. He had not attended their schools, and as a result, he was a threat to their power. So this entire trial, it was just an act. You know, they met at night in order to convict Jesus, but these guys, they had a rule that was said that they were not supposed to meet at night. So in order to try to make the whole thing look like it wasn't a facade, they went ahead and they waited until dawn to announce the sentence. They hired false witnesses to lie about Jesus. The jury, the Sanhedrin, they were biased. The Bible says that they were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. There was no convicting evidence. So the judge, he began working for the prosecution. I want you to listen to Matthew chapter 26. We're going to look at parts of 60 through 63. It says this: "Finally, 2 men came forward who declared, 'This man said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.' Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, 'Well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself?' But Jesus remained silent." 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12 says, "Be careful how you live among your unbelieving neighbors. Even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior and they will believe and give honor to God." Sometimes whenever the accusations against you are weak, the best thing that you can do is just keep quiet. Don't even give credibility by answering. Well, verse 63, it goes on to say, "Then the high priest said to him, 'I demand in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God.'" Now in our day, you don't have to answer if your answer is going to incriminate you. But back in that day, if the high priest said, "I charge you under oath to answer," you had no choice, you had to do it. So Jesus said, "Yes, I am the Messiah. It is as you say." Now, if we were presiding in the court of law, wouldn't your next step be to determine whether or not these claims might be true? You know, Jesus says, "Yes, I am the Messiah." So the logical next step would be to, well, what proof do you have? You know, because the Old Testament said that the Messiah, he was going to be born of a virgin, that he was going to be born in a town called Bethlehem. Are those things true about you? You know, the Messiah, he should be able to perform miracles. Can you do that? But Jesus was asked no such questions. Instead, in verse 65 and verse 66, it says, "Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror, and he said, 'Blasphemy! Why do we need other witnesses? You've all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?' 'Guilty,' they shouted. 'He must die.'" And then I want you to listen to this phrase in verse 67. It says, "Then they began to spit in Jesus' face." These sophisticated elders and the temple guards, they begin to spit on Jesus. Now, of all the acts of defiance, none is more disgusting than to have somebody spit on you. And I think as that spit began to run down Jesus' face and down his cheek, and it rested in his beard, and he couldn't wipe it off because he was tied up, I think it was at about that time that 10,000 angels in heaven, they drew their swords and they looked to the Heavenly Father for permission to take charge. But heaven was silent and Jesus did not respond. The Bible tells us that he had been blindfolded by this point. It says, some slapped him and they said, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who hit you that time?" But Jesus was guilty of nothing. He was tied up and they began to beat on him because they had been so bitter about him for 3 years, and now they had their chance to really let it out. That's injustice, but that was just the beginning. The next trial that took place was before Pilate. Trial number 3 was with Pilate. Let's look at Matthew chapter 27, verse 1 and 2. It says, "Very early in the morning, the leading priests and elders of the people, they met again to lay plans for putting Jesus to death. Then they bound him, led him away, and took him to Pilate, the Roman governor." At dawn, they had dragged Jesus before Pilate, the Roman governor, in order to try to get Roman approval to execute him. But now they had a real problem, because Rome was not going to give approval to execute a man on the grounds of blaspheming a god. Because Rome, they recognized many gods. So it wasn't going to bother the Roman government if a Jewish god had been blasphemed. So the Sanhedrin, they had to change their accusation against Jesus if they were going to be able to get the death penalty. So they said to Pilate, they said, "This man, he claims to be the king of the Jews, but we have no king other than Caesar. And he's guilty of rebellion, and he's even telling people not to pay their taxes to Caesar." Well, let's listen to Matthew 27, 11 through 14. It says, "Now Jesus was standing before Pilate, the Roman governor. 'Are you the king of the Jews?' the governor asked him. Jesus replied, "You have said it." But when the leading priest and the elders made their accusations against him, Jesus remained silent. "Don't you hear all these charges they're bringing against you?" Pilate demanded. But Jesus made no response to any of the charges, much to the governor's surprise. See, Pilate now is beginning to be pretty impressed with the poise of Jesus. Because normally whenever a man's life is at stake, he leaps to his own defense. He will beg for mercy. He'll shout back at his accusers. But whenever the mob yelled and they shouted accusations at Jesus, he stood in silence. Well, Pilate, he then sends Jesus to Herod for another trial. Pilate, he didn't want anything to do with Jesus because his wife had warned him that she'd had some pretty weird dreams about this Jesus guy. She told Pilate, she said, "Don't have anything to do with him because I really think that you're going to regret it later." So Pilate, he learned that Jesus was from Galilee, and that was Herod's territory. And conveniently, Herod happened to be in town, and he was staying just a few doors down. So Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, and that's trial number 4, is before Herod. Let's look at Luke chapter 23, verse 8. It says, "Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him, and he'd been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle." But Jesus, he refused to even speak to Herod. We need to remember that this Herod was the exact same guy that had Jesus' close friend and his cousin, John the Baptist, beheaded. Luke 23, 9 through 11 says, "He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the teachers of religious law, they stood there shouting their accusations. Then Herod and his soldiers, they began mocking and ridiculing Jesus. Finally, they put a royal robe on him and they sent him back to Pilate. Now, I can't stand to have people mock or ridicule me. Even if they do it jokingly, I feel like I still need to respond. It's hard not to say something back to them. They put a stylish robe on Jesus and they said, "Hail King!" And Jesus just stood there with his hands tied. Now, he could have broke those ropes just like that. He could have wiped out the entire court. But he kept his cool and he remained silent. Well, Herod then sends him back to Pilate for another trial. So trial number 5 is Pilate again. Now, Pilate, he was trying to weasel out by sending Jesus over to Herod. That didn't work, so Pilate has to meet with Jesus again. He tried to release Jesus, though, instead of Barabbas. You see, the Romans knew that the Passover week, it could be a very dangerous time in Jerusalem. The tensions were really high. The streets were packed full of people. So the Romans, they started this tradition where they would release a Jewish prisoner to try to please the crowd, to try to ease some of the tension. This was a really wise move on their part for PR purposes. So Pilate, he asked them, he says, "Who would you like for me to release this year? Jesus of Nazareth or Barabbas?" And Pilate thought, well, surely they're going to choose Jesus over this killer. But much to Pilate's surprise, they called out, "Release Barabbas." Well, Pilate, he tried to reason with the people, and he says, "Why? What crime has Jesus committed?" And they shouted even louder, "Crucify him." Well, next, Pilate, he tries to calm the people down by having Jesus beaten. Now, this really makes no sense to me. He thinks that Jesus is an innocent man, but yet he has him beat in order to try to please the people. Well, then Pilate, he brought the bloodied Jesus in front of the crowd and he said, "Behold the man, look at the man. Isn't this enough?" But they weren't satisfied. The sight of Jesus' blood, it only made them want more. And again, they screamed, "Crucify him." And Pilate saw that there was going to be no way out. So in order to try to pass the buck, he ceremonially, he washed his hands in front of the crowd and he said, "I am innocent of this man's blood." And the people said, "Well, let his blood be on us and be on our children." But even when Pilate had handed Jesus over to the soldiers to be crucified, the abuse was far from over. Listen to Matthew chapter 27, verse 27 through 31. It says, "Some of the governor's soldiers took Jesus into their headquarters and they called out the entire regiment. They stripped him and they put a scarlet robe on him. They wove thorn branches into a crown and they put it on his head. And they placed a reed stick in his right hand as a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mockery and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him, and they grabbed the stick and they struck him in the head with it. And when they were finally tired of mocking him, they took off the robe and they put his own clothes on him again. And then they led him away to be crucified. Jesus faced terrible injustice. Well, before we close today, there's 4 lessons that I want us to see that I think that we can apply to our lives whenever we face injustice. First thing I want us to see is when you're mistreated, take time to honestly evaluate the situation. Take time to honestly evaluate the situation. I think it's important that we remember that Jesus spent the night before his trials alone in prayer. So before we gripe about how badly we've been treated, we need to honestly look at the situation. That may mean that you need to spend some time alone with God and just remove yourself from the situation. It may include talking to friends who aren't emotionally involved. It would certainly require a humble spirit and an honest spirit. Because you see, unlike Jesus, we may not be seeing the situation correctly. We can all say things impulsively and make quick decisions that are completely wrong. And then later we have to apologize and admit that we weren't mistreated at all. Let's look together at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 15 and verse 16. It says, "If you suffer, however, it must not be for murder, stealing, making trouble, or prying into other people's affairs. But it is no shame to suffer for being a Christian." So just make sure that you're suffering and not imagining that you're suffering. The second thing that I think we need to see is don't be surprised at the evil of people. Don't be surprised at the evil of people. Jesus was a perfect man, yet nobody was abused more by people than Jesus. The people of this world can be very cruel. We shouldn't be surprised at how people will lie, how they'll slander, how they'll hurt and kill and try to destroy others. I think we people in the church, we're guilty of wrong thinking so many times. We expect non-Christians to act like Christians, but yet we allow Christians to act like non-Christians. That shouldn't be the case. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9 says, "The human heart is the most deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is?" Now, there are some people in the world that are better than others, but most people are selfish. Most people, they look out for number one, and if they have to step on you to climb up the ladder for their advantage, that's exactly what they're going to do. So whenever you're dealing with the devil, don't be surprised whenever you get the sharp end of the pitchfork. But Jesus, he was abused by the religious people of his days. These people were supposed to be good people, and that's even harder to take. You know, people say things like, "My own child lied about me. My own father abused me. A church member cheated me." Well, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12 and 13 says, "Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials that you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you. Instead, be very glad, because these trials will make you partners with Christ in his suffering." Well, the third lesson that I want us to see is when people treat you unfairly, keep your cool. Jesus did. Keep your cool. Jesus did. He stood for truth, yet he was able to keep his cool. You see, you can be 100% right in principle, but you can be completely wrong in your attitude. Galatians chapter 5, verse 15 says, "But if you're always biting and devouring one another, watch out. Beware of destroying one another." The NCAA tournament, it kicked off this past week, and it's been really exciting so far. But every year in the tournament, there's always a coach or two that acts like really big babies. They scream about how they got cheated or how unfair things are. Well, one of the greatest college basketball coaches of all time was a guy by the name of John Wooden. He coached at UCLA. Now, back in 1968, UCLA, they had a 47-game win streak that was snapped against the University of Houston in a nationally televised game that took place in the Astrodome down in Houston. It's still to this day one of the most famous college basketball games that's ever been played. It was a pressure-packed game, and UCLA's star player, a guy by the name of Lou Alcindor, who would later on be known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he suffered an eye injury during the game. He didn't play very well. He only made 4 out of his 18 shots that night. In UCLA's win streak, it was snapped whenever they lost in the final seconds of the game by 2 points. Well, as soon as the game was over, right during the middle of the disappointment, somebody stuck a microphone under the nose of John Wooden and said, "Coach, do you think the outcome would have been different if Alcindor had been healthy?" Now, if that would have been me, I would have said, "Well, that's a dumb question. What do you think? We just barely got beat, and he just barely even scored any points. Plus, the referees were terrible. We're going to show them in the tournament." But John Wooden, he just smiled, and he said, "Well, you never know about those things. Maybe if Alcindor had been healthy, he wouldn't have played as well as he did. I just want to go ahead and congratulate Houston's coach Guy Lewis and their players for an excellent game." Now that's class. Now, by the way, later in that year, those two teams would play in the semifinals of the NCAA tournament, and UCLA won that game by 32 points. It's hard to take disappointment whenever you're mistreated, but we need to respond with grace. Sometimes it means that you just keep silent and you don't say anything at all. Other times you need to tell the truth, but you need to do it kindly. Now, it doesn't mean that you let people walk all over you, but it does mean that you keep your cool. You act kindly even towards people that mistreat you. Jesus said, "Now you've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but let me tell you something. When you get hit on one cheek, you turn the other cheek, and in doing so, you'll glorify the Father." Now, it's tough to do, but when you're mistreated and it's real, we need to keep our composure. Well, the last lesson that I want us to see is when you're mistreated, trust God even if you don't understand Him. Trust God even if you don't understand Him. Whenever life tends to let us down, we begin to blame God. We say things like, "Hey, I've lived a good life. I go to church. I'm in a life group." But other people who don't even go to church, they've got money and I'm struggling. I'm poor over here. You see, we begin with disappointment in life, and that leads to seeds of doubt about God, and then anger towards God, and then sometimes even betrayal towards God. But when you're angry with God, would you look again at the final hours of Jesus? He got abuse and mistreatment worse than any of us have ever gone through. And God did not step in to stop it, but God was not unfair. God was not silent. He was not hidden. God was waiting, and God was just, and He allowed Jesus to go through all of this injustice and all this abuse and ultimately death so that our sins could be laid on Him so that one day we would be forgiven. And now, instead of saying, "I wish Jesus didn't have to go through all that," we can say, "You know what? It didn't make sense at the time, but it sure makes sense for eternity. Because it's through Jesus' death and abuse that I can be healed of my sins and I can be forgiven." 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 19 through 24 says, "For God is pleased when, conscious of His will, you patiently endure unjust treatment. Of course, you get no credit for being patient if you're beaten for doing wrong. But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it patiently, God is pleased with you. For God called you to do good, even if it means suffering, just as Christ has suffered for you. He is your example, and you must follow in His steps. He never sinned nor deceived anyone. He did not retaliate when He was insulted, nor threaten revenge when He suffered. He left His case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. He personally carried our sins in His body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. By His wounds, you are healed."